Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the November, not December yet, November 2025 talk for members for the Castle Studies Group. I'm very excited that we're looking beyond the shores of the UK today and heading to the Eastern Baltic, which I imagine is also similarly cold at this time of year. We're very lucky to be joined by Aleks Pluskowski. And he'll be talking about the castles of the Teutonic Order. I don't think we've had a crusade flavour to our talks yet. At the very least, I probably owe one of our speakers an apology if I've forgotten them in the process. So, I think now is the time to hand over to Alex, and we'll hear all about his topic.
Great. Thanks very much for that introduction, Richard. Hopefully everybody can hear me clearly. So this is going to be a bit of a whistle-stop tour through what is actually quite a vast and diverse topic. And I thought what I would do would be to split it into a series of themes. So I'll start with an introduction to the Teutonic Order, and to the context in general, the geographic context. And then we'll look at the order's castles of the actual period of active crusading in the 13th century, the period of conquest of the lands of the Eastern Baltic. And then we'll hone in on the order's most impressive castles, the conventual castles. We'll be asking if these were fortified monasteries. And then we'll zoom in even more on the most impressive castle, I think, ever built, which today is called Malbork, Marienburg in German. And that will lead us on to the final theme, which will look at the roles of these castles in governing the lands acquired by the order at this time. And if I have time at the end, hopefully I will say a little bit about what the castles are like today and how they've been studied uh, in the last couple of centuries. Just a few comments on that, really. So, by way of introduction, I want to say a few words about the Teutonic Order itself, which some of you may have come across. This starts life as a field hospital founded by German merchants from Bremen and Lübeck during the Siege of Acre as part of the Third Crusade. So at the end of the 12th century. Now, with increasing German involvement in the crusading movement, the field hospital, which is catering to German-speaking crusaders, uh, becomes militarized. And so it's essentially institutionalized as a quasi-monastic order of, we can call them warrior monks, like the Templars, like the Hospitallers. And in fact, the Teutonic Order, the German order, as it's called, draws on the rules of both the Templars and the Hospitallers to inform its own structure. Now, aside from a compound in Acre, which is their first and most important house, they establish a second center of power at Montfort in the Galilee that you can see the ruins pictured there. And this is built on the family estates of Jocelyn, the Count of Edessa, who the order acquire in 1220. They're then invited by the King of Hungary, Andrew II, to secure his eastern frontier in Transylvania, where the Carpathians wrap around to the south. And here they build a handful of castles, the most important of which is Marienburg. We've heard that name before. We'll hear her again. I think this is the first castle built by the order that is named the Castle of Mary. The Virgin Mary becomes the most important figure in the order, or for the order rather. And this castle, you can see the ruins there that have been identified. They're from a later period. Excavations have revealed the 13th century wall that was slightly smaller there. And these castles were built in a region populated by German settlers who'd been invited previously by Hungarian rulers in this region known as the Butzenland. Now, the order at this time become involved in the Fifth Crusade in 1217, which targets Egypt, and this sees their membership soar. But not long after, in 1225, they're expelled from Transylvania by the Hungarian king who seizes their lands for all sorts of reasons we don't have time to go into, but essentially they breach their remit and start expanding into territory that is not given to them by the king. And within a few years, they've accepted invitation to secure another frontier on the edge of the Polish Principality of Mazovia. And that's what we're going to focus on. They come to dominate the Crusades in the Baltic, even as the Crusader states in the Levant are gradually conquered by the Mamluks. So Montfort Castle is taken and destroyed in 1271, and that's the reason you can see the ruins there. And Acre, the last Christian outpost in the Levant relating to the Crusader states, fell 20 years later. At this point, the order moves its HQ to Venice, although it also possesses numerous properties in the Holy Roman Empire. It ultimately ends up focusing its efforts on the Baltic region. So these are the countries that we're going to be looking at today. And when I'm going to be showing you the individual castles, I will be putting in the historical names and the modern names and the historical and the modern regions to guide you. But essentially, we're going to be interested in northern Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, and this little slither in between that was given to Russia in 1945, the Kaliningrad Oblast. Um, the territories extended a little bit into Belarus as well. But as you'll see, that core of Eastern Baltic is what we're going to be focusing on. And I want to take you back to give you some context to the pre-Crusade period, the end of the 12th, beginning of the 13th century, where the targets of the Crusades are societies highlighted in white and yellow. So these are groups in the Eastern Baltic that are divided into the Western Balts, highlighted in white, and the Baltic Finns, highlighted in yellow. And they're surrounded by Christian states. So to the east, you've got the Eastern Orthodox Rus principalities. The most powerful becomes Novgorod to the north. And to the west, you've got Catholic kingdoms, the Kingdom of Poland, Denmark, Sweden, and then you've got the Holy Roman Empire. So these pagan societies are sandwiched in between these Christian superpowers, we can call them, relatively speaking. And these pagan societies are small scale, ruled by families residing in strongholds, some of which control quite large regions, many of which control much smaller regions. Only the Lithuanians form what we can call a state by the mid 13th century, and that's the Grand Duchy. So, crusading begins in this region at the end of the 12th century. It's led by German missionary bishops, and the Danish king also becomes involved in the conquest of North Estonia, North Livonia there on the map. Now, the order is invited to participate in the Polish Crusades against the Prussians, and I'll say a bit more about that in just a minute. And they enter through Prussia in 1230, and then a few years later, they become involved in the Crusades in Livonia. And these turn into full-blown conquests of the regions, and the order becomes the most important agent leading the crusading enterprises and annexing land in the process. They face a series of insurrections that they survive, and then immediately after the conquests of these lands, they begin an ongoing conflict with Lithuania through a series of some 300 campaigns that are referred to as Reisen or journeys, which continue even after Lithuania officially converts to Catholicism in 1387. So these continue, as I've marked there, through to 1422. Now, the order's military successes have been attributed to heavy cavalry and crossbows, but in fact, it was the crusading mechanism itself which enabled the conquest. What this means is the order could rely on a regular supply of armies from neighboring Catholic regions to replenish its military resources, and so its garrisons could hold out with relatively small numbers. This is something that the targets of the Crusaders did not have. Okay, so on to the order's castles during the period of active crusading in the 13th century. And I've put in there a quote from the Livonian Rhine Chronicle. This is a chronicle written in Middle High German in the last decade of the 13th century. It describes the Crusades in Livonia, and it's the first piece of literature produced by a member of the Teutonic Order that we know of. And this particular passage refers to the order's brethren in Livonia advising the master, the master of that province within the Teutonic Order structure, in his campaign against this southern group of Western Balts, the Semigalians. And as you can see, the key to that is to build castles. And this is what the order did. They become the most prolific castle builder in the region. They're not the only one, and they're not the first. German bishops, their vassals, and Danish crusaders build castles in Livonia as well. For all these groups, castles are fundamental to the process of conquest and colonization. They provided garrison outposts that are used to attract migrant settlers and crusaders and control the annexed territories by force. So the order's involvement in the Baltic actually begins a little earlier than pictured here, back in 1222, when they accompany a crusade led by the Duke of Silesia. Henry, Silesia is in the southwestern corner of Poland, along with a contingent of Templars, and this also involves Henry's cousin Conrad, the Duke of Mazovia. Now, Conrad, over several years, negotiates with the Teutonic Order to persuade them to take back a region that he claimed, that you can see pictured there, called the Kulmerland in the southwestern corner there on the Mazovian frontier, that had been overrun by the pagan Prussians. Now, the order eventually agree once they've stopped becoming involved in the Fifth Crusade and in the conflict between the Pope and the Emperor, where they play an important diplomatic role. And they established themselves in a stronghold called Vogelsang, the first one pictured there in 1230, and crossed the Vistula River, initiating a new era of castle building. Now, the castles that are initially built are timber and earth fortifications, and they've left very few traces. They're easy and quick to build, and they are garrisoned by small numbers of men. As noted in the chronicles, they're used as mustering points for crusading armies and as basis for launching further military action. So what you can see on the map there is really the progress of constructing strongholds, a number of which were constructed on existing or former strongholds that had been destroyed by the Prussians. And you can see that the progress of the Teutonic Order, of the Crusades, follows the Vistula to the north and then the coast of the Vistula Lagoon. So these castles are constructed, we know about them from the chronicles, from the written sources, and a number of them are rebuilt many times as a result of Prussian insurrections. Several were dismantled and relocated, or the material was recycled. Here is one of the earliest, the castle at Thorn. I'll just go back and show you where that is at the very bottom there. You can see Thorn and Old Thorn. So originally, the first base across the Vistula is established at Old Thorn, Toruń, today in Poland. And after a few years, as a result of flooding, it's relocated to the location where it is today. You can see there the town of Toruń, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's a beautifully preserved medieval town, but in the bottom right corner, you can see the remains of a Teutonic Order's castle that was completely destroyed by the townspeople in the mid 15th century, part of a rebellion against the order. But what you can see there is a plan of the early castle. And this is quite typical of the first castles built by the order, consisting of a single range up against an enclosure wall and an embankment. And here, as elsewhere, earlier existing earthworks were used, in this case, built by the Masovians in previous centuries. Some of the sources refer to towers, probably timber framed ones, and also to the presence of chapels, which are required in the order's rule. And we know that they're also referred to in relation to the presence of relics in a number of these chapels. And relics are part of the supernatural battle waged by the Crusaders against what they see as the dark forces of paganism during the conquests. So, quite a fundamental part of transforming the spiritual landscape as a result of the Crusades. Now, Torn is considered to be the first castle to have stone and brick elements. Probably when this is designated as a command center, I'll come back to these. You'll hear a lot more about these throughout the course of this talk. But between 1248 and 1251, this becomes a sort of administrative center for the territory carved out. And probably this is a time when significant investment in stone and brick castle begins. And the town that develops next to it develops in tandem, essentially. But you can see that the walls cover areas that were considered to be a blind spot to the east, to the southeast as well. And eventually, in the second phase, the circular U-shaped wall surrounding the castle is completed, and then this becomes more elaborate subsequently. And here you can just see a photo showing the excavations through the castle wall, where you can see the stone foundations, field stones, and then bricks would be placed on top of those. When the order moves deeper into Prussian territory to the north, they're also occupying some of the strongholds they conquer. And this is one example. This becomes known as Christburg. Incidentally, that name, which means Christ's Castle, probably derives from a Prussian-German hybrid name, using the Prussian word for black and the German name for castle, so Black Castle. And then later on, the Christian meaning of Christ's Castle is added, probably in the early 14th century. The order sort of see themselves as creating a new religious landscape at this point. And as you can see, the order's fortifications follow the outlines of the original stronghold, but you can see there in the 3D model of the topography, the internal space was subdivided. The internal space of the existing Prussian stronghold, probably for the range, chapel, and the other shared spaces used by the Teutonic Order to suit their monastic lifestyle. And I'll say a bit more about that a little later on. The site's eventually abandoned, and the order set about constructing a new site nearby. Just to the north of this, we've got an example of a stronghold built on a completely fresh site, in this case on an island in the river at Elbing in 1237, today Elbląg in Poland. And 2 decades later, this would become the main command center for the order's conquered lands in Prussia. And as you can see, a town is built next to it. And then later on in the 14th century, we've got another town built across from there as well. Now, I put this in because you can see their excavations showing these giant timbers. This is actually probably the best preserved example of a timber fortification from the 1230s, from the early crusading period in Prussia. And these timbers are huge, a meter or so across, these vast oaks. And they're bigger than anything that is found in the town. And the town has been excavated and large numbers of timber buildings have been found from the early phase of colonization. So we thought about what this might mean, and perhaps what we're seeing here is examples of sacred trees that have been cut down and incorporated into the superstructure of the early castle. Now, it's speculative. There is a place just to the south of Elbing that was given the name Heiligenwald, which means sacred woods. It's entirely in keeping with the order's behavior that such places could have been felled and then the trees incorporated into the castle, be making a very clear statement within what was seen as a spiritual war against paganism. The castle chapel is also then given a piece of a true cross, which originally had been given to the order's master by the German emperor. So that gives it a very powerful relic and attracts pilgrims subsequently. Now, in the same year that the order are building Elbing, they become involved in Livonia, so what is today Latvia and Estonia, where they inherit the castles built by the Sword Brothers. Now, this is a group, a military order founded by the Bishop of Riga in 1202. They drive the conquests of Livonia, become landowners and castle builders, again with the aim of securing their lands. And so they're associated with the first phase of castle building in Livonia. And I pictured the castles, the main castles that they built there in red, with Revel at the very top that they took from the Danish king, along with northern Estonia. Now, these are mostly masonry castles built from stone with timber elements as well, with the exception of Volmar, that is largely timber. This organization, the Sword Brothers, were struggling financially and had considered merging with the order. But events accelerated this, and they've got a reconstruction there of the Battle of Saule in 1236, where a large number of the Sword Brothers were killed, along with their master Volkwin. And the following year, with papal approval, the Sword Brothers were amalgamated into the ranks of the Teutonic Order, who took over their castles and their lands and sent over some 600 personnel, including 60 brother knights, to Livonia to take possession. So these are the sorts of castles the Teutonic Order inherited. This is Venden in sort of central northern Latvia today, Cesis in Latvia, probably the most important historical monument from this period. The Sword Brothers originally fortified a hill fort just across from the castle at Riekstu Hill, what's called Old Venden, with the local group, the so-called Wendish group living there, who converted to Christianity. And within a decade, they had started to build a castle next to the hill fort, of which only the chapel subsequently survives. So you can see there the early castle form built by the Sword Brothers that the Teutonic Order inherited was a single range with a chapel and then with this enclosed perimeter. Now, the Order invest in a program of construction, replacing or augmenting the Sword Brothers castles over time. So by the end of the 13th century, there are nearly 50 castles in Livonia, of which about half have been built by the Order, the rest by bishops and the Danes. And then in the 14th century, some 54 are built, primarily on major rivers or along the Lithuanian borderland. And here's an example of one of the new castles at Karksi in Estonia. Karkus would have been its German name. And excavations by my colleague Heikki Valk that we were involved in many years ago demonstrated this castle was built on a completely new site, so not on an existing stronghold like many others in Livonia. And why? This castle was built in relation to the redevelopment of communication routes that linked Riga through to Venden, through to Estonian lands, and up to Revel, what is today Tallinn, the capital of Estonia. So the Crusades sort of reorganized the communication routes, and those indigenous strongholds, not deemed useful in relation to this new road system, were abandoned and not used by the Order. like, for example, Lochavery, you can see there on the map in the left-hand corner. This was not used, even though it was a really important regional power center. This is what our excavations revealed. Beautiful organic deposits. Doesn't look like much, but actually this is an archaeologist's dream. They were packed with all manner of artifacts and organic artifacts, and we were able to radiocarbon date that occupation phase from the 1260s to the 1290s. So a period of consolidation where the Teutonic Order is investing in these castles for consolidating their estates. And you can see decorated pieces of birch bark, stoneware, and these very rare examples of tally sticks. These are for recording taxation from the indigenous Estonian subjects of the order. So you can see also the role of the castles as administrative centers. With the first Prussian rebellion against the order in 1243 to 1249, the Teutonic Order only ends up holding on to 5 strongholds, and it makes them realize the disadvantages of timber and earth fortifications. And this may be the impulse for constructing the first brick castles, a handful of which, such as Torn, Balga, I'll show you that in just a second. And then new castles are built later on after the Second Prussian Uprising in the 1260s and 70s. And we can date these by the brickwork. So I've shown you there a few examples. Most of what you can see is from Malbork Marienburg Castle, but that one from Bierzgłowo, Bergelau is also quite nice. These bricks where you can see 2 stretchers between headers. Yeah, so in Bierzgłowo and Malbork at the top there, these are the earliest brick, what we call brick bonds, Wendish bonds, and these can be dated to the 1280s, the early phases of these castles. Then below that, you see 1 brick and 1 header. This is the so-called Gothic bond that appears in the 14th century. So this has been actually confirmed by OSL dating in a big study done in Malbork Castle. So we know the chronology is roughly correct, but generally speaking, this is how the architecture has been dated. Now, Balga is one of the first castles built on the site of, in this case, an indigenous Prussian stronghold. The wall and the central polygonal building date from the mid 13th century. It would have included a chapel and would have served as one of these new centers of administration. But brick building becomes popular, but timber structures continue to be used actually all the way through into the 15th century by the order. But this new wave of construction in Prussia that begins in the 1270s and 80s really takes place because military hostilities have ended. The order now control Prussia and they can invest in brick castles. Now, these are more compact, more regular, and there is a marked shift in design. And here you can see the castle of, sorry, that's misspelled, should be Engelsberg with an E. That's Angel's Castle, that is constructed in the 1270s and 80s that gradually replaces the earlier timber and earth stronghold that was built not long after the order entered this region. The shape of the castle was constrained by its topographic setting, but you can see them pictured in black there, the first range, which is more compact and more regular. There's also more investment in Livonian castles, and with it, the proliferation of a more regular form. So here you can see the castle at Vindau or Ventspils on the Curonian coast, so southwestern coast of Latvia. The tower is built in 1270 and the construction of the 4 ranges shortly after, with a chapel and a refectory, a shared eating space for the brethren. This is the beginning of what we call the conventual castle, a regular form of castle built by the order. So, the conventual castle is developed for a specific purpose. It is basically the main building associated with a new system of territorial governance that emerges with the crusades and with the conquests. After each conquest, each annexation of land, The territory is divided into regions called commanderies. Each of these are controlled by an official called a commander and their chapter, the group of brethren in a convent, usually numbering 12 to reflect the apostles, but in reality, much more, or in some cases, less. And the first commanderies are defined in Livonia in the 1230s and 1240s, and then in Prussia in the 1240s and 1250s. And on this map, you can see the territories in white are the territories of the order in Livonia and Prussia. These are the individual commanderies, although some were controlled by other types of officials called advocates. And I've also pictured there how the Teutonic Order expanded its territories in the 14th century into Catholic Pomerania, into northern Estonia, which it purchases from a Danish crown in 1346, into Gotland, eventually into Samogitia. And all of this requires new territorial subdivisions and convents built to manage them. And this lasts until 1525 in Prussia and 1561 in Livonia. Here you can see a close-up of the order's lands in Prussia at their full extent, with the convents marked by these black crosses. So this sort of gives you a better idea of the territorial administration, and the castles directly relate to this. So I've pictured there also the advocates' castles and a lesser official, the procurator, who was essentially delegated to manage sub-districts, and each of these got their own fortified residences. So there's a hierarchy of castles that is created by the order, and we're going to focus on a few of these examples. But I want to say a bit about the conventual castle, because this really comes to define the Teutonic Order in the Baltic. And it's a form that we heard was beginning to be developed in the 1270s and 80s, but it really becomes perfected in the first half of the 14th century. And the picture you can see, the castle in Gniew today in Poland, Mewe previously in Prussia. This is often cited as the best example, best preserved example. In fact, if you look at the reconstruction of a castle, it's originally would have had a massive tower or Bergfried. Now, the castle began to be constructed in 1290 as a convent controlling territory on the western side of the Vistula. And I've highlighted their key features of the castle that would become prevalent in most of the convent buildings, particularly in Prussia. So you can see there the Zwinger, which is a terrace constructed around the outside of a main castle building, basically from heaped up soil held in place by an outer brick wall. And in the process of constructing that, you've got a moat created around that. And you can also then see what I've marked as the Danske, which is a tower that projects beyond the convent building, contains latrines, but also seems to feature as a form of last defense. So this becomes the conventual form. Now, the older irregular castles continue to be expanded in keeping with the new architectural trends. So these features are then added to them, but they maintain their irregular forms. Now, in Prussia, over 90% of the order's convents are built in this way, mostly from brick, but some also from field stones gathered from fields, most probably by the order's subjects, whether indigenous or migrant German or Polish peasants. And here you can see one today at Papovo Biskupia, the ruins of the stone and brick castle, but would have originally been a conventual castle. These are all based on the geometric design principle of ad quadratum, in other words, according to the square, where the proportions and layout of a building or a specific architectural element are generated from a square and its subdivisions. This provides a higher level of symmetry. Now, this was an idealized projection of the order as a monolithic organization. In other words, this is corporate branding. It projects a sense of authority and also unity. No matter where you went, you saw the same branding and you realize the order is in charge. But with this symmetry, the order are also symbolizing the divine order, the celestial realm. These are houses of crusaders, of Christ's knights defending Christianity from paganism, which is how the order promoted itself in northeastern Europe. These are quasi monastic spaces insofar as the brethren are following a monastic rule. They are eating together, sleeping in shared spaces. But unlike in monasteries, the chapel did not dominate these buildings. It was rather tucked away on the first floor and incorporated, in most cases, into the symmetry of the building. And so there were differences, even though there may have been monastic inspirations behind this. The castles were strengthened with fortified elements, which included systems of moats, walls that separated the main convent building from its outer wards, and with the inclusion of these big towers or burgfrieds. So you can see here examples of the towers. In the case of Brodnica in Poland, formerly Strasbourg in West Prussia, only the tower really survives. Now, I've highlighted these towers because they're obviously impressive monuments designed to be seen from afar and clear symbols of authority. So again, this is highlighting the order's branding. And there's been a lot of debate on the origins of a conventual castle. We could have a whole talk just on this. And there are two schools of thought, basically a local development or one that results from external impulses, external models. All sorts of influences have been cited. The Empire, the Levant, Bohemia, the Cistercian order. What is clear, though, is that the order makes a collective decision, probably in their general chapter, to adopt a standardized design that then is rolled out across their territories. We don't have enough data to know really where the earliest form was. We know, for example, that we have these convent forms built in Livonia. You've got the example here of Riga and Viljandi or Felin, one of the most important castles, one of the biggest. These are the two biggest convent castles in Livonia, with walls going roughly up to 50 meters long. Now, these have been partly dated. I should say that the Riga's castle was destroyed and rebuilt many times. But in the case of Felin, Viljandi, the brickwork suggests we may be dealing with a castle built at the end of the 13th century, but difficult to say. So we don't know if these provided the template, but we do know that if we look at the other big convents in Livonia, we can see the development of regular forms over time, but again, we don't know how early these are. This is Goldingen, that originally is referred to as Christ's castle, Jesus's castle, Jesuborg, but Goldingen is the name that sticks. And you can see here later representations of a conventual castle and a sort of map that's been created without much evidence for the form of a castle because this really hasn't survived and little archaeological work has taken place here. So we still don't really know about the origins, but we do know that the conventual form varies in shape and is adapted to the earlier castles and to the topography. So here we've got Venden, again, that I mentioned earlier. Cesses Castle, you can see here, the castle expanded over time through to the 16th century under the auspices of the order, with additions particularly responding to artillery that's attested in the Eastern Baltic from the mid-14th century. In this particular castle, you can see these green marked towers, these big artillery towers, which includes one of the largest in the Eastern Baltic, the northern tower that I've highlighted there on the plan and on the photo, which has got 4-meter thick walls and 17 chambers containing openings for cannons on the lower levels and firearms on the upper levels. And the order upgraded a lot of its conventual castles to deal with artillery over the course of the later 14th and 15th centuries. I think really the zenith of the design is Ragnit Castle. Originally, this is built in 1289 on the site of a destroyed indigenous stronghold in the eastern Prussian territory of Skalovia on the Lithuanian frontier. What you can see there is the rebuilt castle at the end of the 14th century that really is the model of the convent form. It's huge, it's about 59 meters long on each side, with this expanded ward, and also you can see the Danska, the latrine tower, extending out a significant distance. Now, this, you can see Ragnarok picture there on the map, is a main outpost for the Crusades the Order led into Lithuania, and built a series of castles along the Nemunas River leading into the heart of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. But this is really the main Order's outpost. And so it's quite likely that this is there again to emphasize the Order's corporate branding on the frontier. And we can see this with other frontier castles. So this is Narva on the Estonian-Russian border today. And actually, this is also the Livonian-Rus border in the medieval period. The castle was originally built by the Danes, but when it's obtained by the Teutonic Order in 1346, when they get the whole of the Duchy of Estonia, they start building what becomes a convent, but quite slowly. The tower that you can see is added in the 15th century, and the southern wing is added in the 16th century. So this then becomes a conventual form, and it faces off against the Russian castle built by Ivan III following his conquest of Novgorod. So the two castles sort of face off each other. But again, we're talking really here about branding. And final example I wanted to give of a frontier castle was a smaller structure. Here we've got Neidenburg or Nijica in Poland today, beautifully preserved castle belonging to a procurator, so a lesser official of the order. But this castle is massive and monumental for such a small official. And the reason is it's close to the Masovian border. And so again, this is the order emphasizing its branding. You can see the castle faces the route that goes south into Masovia on a hill, so clearly visible, a display of the order's power and corporate unity. But of course, the pinnacle of the order's investment was Marienburg, Malbork Castle today in northern Poland. This is built from the 1280s through into the early 15th century, so over a century of investment by the order. And the movement of the order's headquarters from Venice to here, to Marienburg in 1309, and then properly a few decades later when it becomes the Grand Master's permanent residence, this prompts a massive expansion of the castle over the course of the 14th century. To an area within its outer perimeter of some 21 hectares. Now, one of the measures of its size is the presence of 3 churches and 4 chapels within the fortified complex at its sort of final stage. And it houses 45 brothers and priests and several hundred servants. So this is the largest and really the biggest expression of the order's power. And you can just see the drone flight, giving you a better impression of the castle. Something you really have to visit to see and to experience. Difficult to really convey with static or even with video images. Now, Malbork's got a complex biography. It was subsequently occupied by various other powers, and its use has changed through to the 20th century. And it saw various phases of restoration and conservation and repair. It was badly damaged during the Second World War as a result of the siege by the Red Army. It was used by a German garrison. And then it was restored from the 1960s onwards and designated as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So with all that in mind, it's seen a lot of work, archaeological, architectural, historical work. And I'm just going to summarize really to you, because I don't have huge amounts of time, how this castle was structured and functioned. So you can see there the castle was attached, or a town became attached to the castle in the 1280s, expanded in the 14th century. And you can see the main route leading through the town really leads up to the castle, a real sort of statement of the role of a castle that towers above it. And the castle was constructed in two or three phases. You have the high castle, the original castle from the 1280s, that's expanded also in the 14th century to form a conventual castle. And then you've got an additional so-called first outer ward, what becomes later known as the middle castle, built with additional facilities for the extended household and the order's guests, and then a further outer ward with an outer perimeter and fish ponds. Now, the outer ward itself was supposed to contain a stable with reference to 1,000 or so horses in the 15th century, just to give you a sense of size. So maybe 1 million bricks are used in the construction of this castle. So you've got these 7 religious spaces in the castle. Here you've got an image of the earliest, the Golden Gate, which dates from the 1280s in the northern range of the castle. Its iconography is remarkably well preserved and it reflects the order combating evil, in other words, paganism, and defending the church. The most striking religious iconography is found here, connected with the Virgin Mary. And I've already mentioned the importance of Mary to the Teutonic Order, but here you've got an 8 foot tall polychrome sculpture made of artificial stone of a Virgin and Child that is created during the extension of the Northern Range in the 1330s and 40s. And the figure is eventually decorated with mosaic tiles in 1380, probably by Venetian craftsmen. So it would have been visible from a distance to anyone approaching the castle from the east. And you can see that Marian imagery also features on the order's coins and even on its weapons on this cannon that also depicts the Virgin Mary and Child. So the Virgin is the patron of the order, the protector of the order, but also the divine sovereign of the order's lands. And the lands were conquered in her name. At the same time as the chapel in Marienburg is being extended, you've got the chapel of St. Anne constructed directly underneath in the mid 14th century that becomes one of the burial places for the Grand Masters. And I show you here the decoration above the doorway, showing you the discovery of the true cross by St. Helena in Jerusalem. So the order still making that connection to their origins in Jerusalem and their original mission to defend the Holy Land. Here we have the Great Refectory, an impressive 5-story range with its own adjoining chapel, constructed in the early decades of the 14th century, and then added to throughout the 14th century. This is the feasting hall for the order and their guests, and for meetings of the general chapter, where maybe up to 250 brothers would have attended. The order's treasury today in Vienna contains artifacts that probably would have been used here. You can see there a salt cellar with so-called adder's tongues that are there to protect the user from poison, typical sort of luxury magical material culture used by the elite in the late medieval period. But these are the kind of objects that the order is investing in at its zenith. And these spaces, along with many other spaces in the castle, would have been heated by hypercore systems. So remarkable technology that filtered warm air through the floors and walls of some of these shared spaces. They would have also been decorated with crusading motifs. So there you can see the 19th century paintings that you can still see today in Malbork Castle, but underneath were found earlier wall paintings showing almost certainly the Crusades. And you've got an image there from another castle today in Pavlovo in Russia. The painting has not survived, but a copy here shows the Archangel Michael as crusader fighting the dragon from Revelation. So the Teutonic Order framing its crusading mission in apocalyptic terms. Adjoining the Great Refectory was the Grand Master's Palace. This is really a building that's built up in the later 14th century, although the original residence is created when the Grand Master's residence moves there in the 1330s. And this really epitomizes how the leaders of the Teutonic Order became almost like monarchs, like secular rulers, with lavish residences, essentially a sort of mini castle, a mini keep within Marienburg. And I put in there the master's chamber from Venden, which we've already seen in Livonia, because this is built under similar circumstances by the Livonian master Walter von Plettenberg at a time when the Livonian leadership is breaking free of the order's rule in Prussia. Remember, the order has this top-down hierarchical structure centered on the figure of a Grand Master, and that's delegated to provincial masters. But this starts to fall apart in the 15th century, and by the 16th century, the Livonian masters are pretty interdependent. And you can see there on Plettenberg's coins, he's also emphasizing himself as a figure of authority rather than the corporate image of the order. And so then this is reflected in lavish investments in buildings. And to lead us on to the final theme I want to talk about, the creation of the castle of Marienburg and its expansion is also visible in the landscape. And just one element of that here, you can see some 40 kilometers of waterways are connected together and redirected to feed the mill runs that eventually flow into the moat systems of Marienburg Castle. So massive hydraulic engineering work involving drainage and redirection of water. You can see the canals still survive in the landscape today and still have water running through them. And of course, this is all done with the labor of settlers, but also elements of the indigenous population who became subjects of the order. So it brings me on to the theme of these castles as the centers of landscapes of governance. And I don't know if you can see in the distance there, this is a view of the landscape north of the castle of Malborg, Marienburg, some 10 kilometers, where the castle would be visible from the landscape. Here we're in the tower of a church and one of the colonizing settlements established after the Crusades. But that impact on the landscape would have been significant. And I want to sort of break it down a little bit and take you through the anatomies of some of these districts, some of these commanderies. So here you can see the commandery of Venden, so Cessis that we've looked at now a few times, which on the left-hand side, the commandery is pictured subdivided into smaller districts, each of which would have had its own castle, delegated to the convent at Venden itself. And because of this, because the commanders of Venden controlled these multiple districts, the actual territory around Venden was given over to an advocate and also delegated to another official in a smaller castle at Arash that I'll talk about in just a second. This entire district becomes converted into almost a private district for the Livonian master in the 15th century. And this goes along with the increasing autonomy and power of the Livonian masters. And so this is when we start to see investment in the castle as the master's residence. Here, however, is the smaller castle of Arash, or Irashi today. This is a reconstruction by Peter Dennis, who kindly did some reconstructions for us when we were working on these castles many years ago. A relatively modest castle consisting of a single range and an enclosure. What was interesting, though, was that excavations in the outer wall of the castle, this sits incidentally on a sort of peninsula that juts into a lake, it revealed buildings and artifacts associated with the indigenous population. So these castles were garrisoned by German brothers of the Teutonic Order, but staffed by the indigenous population here. And colleagues of mine, Norman Stiverins and his team, did a lot of environmental analysis of sediments from the lake in this castle and compared it with the use of a landscape in the late Iron Age by an indigenous group here who constructed a fortified lake settlement that you can see also in Peter's reconstruction there. Now, the sort of scary graphs on the left-hand side. Don't worry too much about those. That's from Norman's work. What they're basically telling you, I've highlighted there the pollen, which basically tells you that during the period of the Teutonic Order, more pollen is getting into the lake, which implies a more open landscape. So this is telling us there is cultivation taking place. And what you can also see there is magnetic susceptibility. This is also an index of more soil flowing into the lake. What that means is less trees, more erosion. So again, the landscape is being opened up. And we also see there some indicators of cultivation and also of animal pasturing. What's also interesting is the analysis of the animal bones from the castle and from the indigenous site reflected a drop in biodiversity. So intensive hunting had already taken place in the Iron Age. What we're dealing with here then is largely a cultivated landscape with pasture during the time of the Order's rule. Now, the Castle of Venden itself is associated with a town. You can see there the town of Cessus today, you can go and visit, expands over a series of phases and is incorporated into the castle's defensive network with its own wall. Now, the Order is the town's overlord and regulated town life in these settlements. The townspeople would have provided military service to the Order. But when we look at records of the Order's visitations to its castles, which in Livonia are actually very limited, here is a rare one from 1451. They're far better preserved in Prussia. We can see a recurring emphasis on recording the garrisons of these castles and their food provisions. So it really was the security of these castles that the Order became interested in during its visitations. And what you can see here on this map, done by a scholar many decades ago, Benny Coven, was mapping the number of brothers in the castles of the Order in Livonia. And you can see the largest ones, Riga, Felin, and Venden, that I've mentioned already. Strategically, the most important castles with the largest garrisons. Now, Cestus Castle, Venden Castle, is important because it's been excavated for many, many decades by Zigrida Apala. In excavations in the early 2000s, they uncovered one of the largest assemblages of medieval armor found in Europe, several hundred pieces from the Western Range that was destroyed by an explosion during the Russian siege in 1577. And what's interesting about this armor, you can see my colleague Gunduz here, who works in the Castle Museum with a reconstruction, a replica of this armor. This armor actually is datable to the end of the 15th century, but was found in the 16th century basement of a castle. So by that point, the Order were unable to upgrade their armor. Their finances were really suffering. They were relying on mercenaries to garrison their castles, and really they were not upgrading their armor at this time. But also, what's been found in this site and in other Order castles are large quantities of goat skulls and horns and fragments of worked antler. These are all ingredients for crossbow production, as we can see from an inventory there from Marienburg. So these are centers of weapon manufacturing. And in fact, the inventories of the castles from Prussia tell us that the castle armories were huge. In the late 14th century, some 600,000 arrows are documented in the Order's Prussian castles, of which 24,000 alone are kept in Marienburg, as well as over a third of all the armor in the Order's lands. And this is the kind of crossbow we're talking about, a horn crossbow. Horn is a very pliable material, and you can make composite bows that become particularly popular from the mid-12th century. But in the Baltic, these become the weapon of choice for the Order, and we have traces of those in the Order's castles. I want to quickly now turn to a different Prussian commandery, that of Raden, today called Radzin Helmiński in the Kormoland, the Ziemia Helmińska in Poland. This is one of the earliest castles. We actually saw this on an early map built in the early crusading period in the 1230s. But this becomes a powerhouse for the mixed economy that supplies agricultural products and livestock with a whole series of specialist farms that you can see pictured in the commandery, the bounds of a commandery of the castle. And we have good surviving inventories for this castle. One of the things it specialized in was horse breeding. What you'll notice here actually is the emphasis on mares kept at the castle for breeding. So these are essentially breeding centers with only a small percentage given up to military use, and those are horses for riding, indicated by the purple line. So only a small component of the horses form the heavy cavalry. The bulk of the horses in these castles are actually used for traction, for work, for couriers, for pulling wagons, for servants. But the order's a big breeder of horses. By the end of the 14th century, Sven Ekdal estimated there would have been some 16,000 horses in Prussia alone on the order's lands. And here we can see inventories of grain. And what this basically tells you is you've got large quantities of unspecified grain collected in the castle for export. So these castles are centers for collectivizing grain, some for local consumption by the community, by the animals, and a lot for export. And this contributed to the order's wealth. If we look at grain storage in Livonia's castles, you can see here how the largest quantities in this same inventory in 1451 were found in Venden Castle. So again, the storage is strategic in terms of how the order organized their provisioning. And I've put there a map of Goldingen Castle that I showed you a little earlier on to show you how its grain resources relied on centers scattered around the order's lands as well as on the island of Gotland. So we're dealing with quite complex networks of provisioning for these castles as well as its local estates. Okay, just to finish with the a different commandery and how it exploited different types of resources. This is the commandery of Brandenburg in Prussia. You can see how it's long and elongated. This is because the commandery is established at the end of the Crusades and then extended over the conquered lands to the east up to the Lithuanian frontier. And the land is delegated to the governance of officials, including procurators. And I just want to concentrate on the district given to the procurator of Lürzen that you can see pictured there at the bottom, with the settlement pattern up to the mid-15th century. Now, this is a landscape of lakes and forests, the Masurian landscape of northeastern Poland today. And here is a reconstruction of the procurator's castle. You can see it is a simple single tower house with this stepped gabled brick architecture on an island with another island representing the outer ward connected with drawbridges using timber palisades. So timber buildings still played a major role. This is representative, quite typical of one of the smaller residences of the order's officials. And this price list from Lürzen Castle gives us a really good idea of what kind of resources are being exploited in this lakeland and forested landscape. And you can see here fur exploitation was particularly important. So these would have been brought by local settlers, villagers to the order's castle, and the order essentially fixed prices for pelts, which it then sold on. And the fur trade was incredibly lucrative for the order and for Hanseatic merchants in the Eastern Baltic. And you can see here, this actually gives you a good impression of the biodiversity of the surrounding landscape. We've got bears, we've got aurochs, we've got beavers, polecats, lynx, wolf. Everything is being harvested here. And so, in other words, the order tailored its individual castles and the officials who ran them to the resources of the surrounding landscapes. So in this sense, the castles represent the exploitation of the colonized and conquered landscapes that the order acquired as a result of the Crusades in the Eastern Baltic. So just to quickly finish, I know I'm running a little over, but I thought it would be interesting to just tell you how the Order's castles are like today. I mean, you've seen a lot of images already. Some have been restored and rebuilt. Some have been converted into hotels. Others are partial ruins with very little remaining and are largely overgrown. And some of them don't even survive above ground, only as earthworks. These castles, as you can appreciate, have had long and complex biographies in the post-medieval period. They've been reused, destroyed, and dismantled, particularly in the 18th century during big periods of conflict, especially between Russia and Sweden and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in the Eastern Baltic. But I thought it would be fun to finish, given the audience here, with a brief history of castle studies. So these sort of pick up the story with uh, the recognition that these monuments shouldn't be dismantled, but rather conserved. So they really begin in the 19th century. I've put the trailblazers here from Prussia and Livonia. So Wilhelm Neumann, pictured there on the right, the director of the Riga Art Museum, does the first surveys of castles in Livonia in the late 1880s, the first to describe the architectural details, plans, and styles. This is done by Conrad Steinbrecht, who studied architecture. He also becomes involved in the German archaeological excavations in ancient Olympia in Greece. So he comes from an archaeological background, publishes the first book on the medieval architecture of Thorn, and then becomes the director of Marienburg Castle in 1882 and really restores it throughout his life and publishes the first detailed study. When he retires, Bernhard Schmidt takes over and continues restoration and research, publishing multiple volumes. So these are the trailblazers who then give way to a new wave of scholarship. Really, there is a bit of a hiatus after the Second World War. And then from the late 80s, 90s, we've got a resurgence, both in Germany and particularly in Poland, in the case of Prussia, where the majority of the historical monuments of Prussia were found after those territories are handed over to Poland in 1945. And I've illustrated here the most important in case you want to follow up. The work of Tomasz Torbus, who's at the University of Gdańsk, Christopher Herman, especially on the architecture of Prussian and Livonian castles, and a lot in Poland. Mariusz Akszyński, who produces the most detailed work from the 1990s at the University of Toruń, and then historians like Janusz Turpinda, who's actually the director of a castle museum in Malbork, who's been responsible for looking at these castles from a historical perspective. It's worth saying that Malbork has produced large volumes of detailed architectural and historical studies on a regular basis. It's probably the best studied castle complex in Central and Eastern Europe in terms of scholarship. And I draw your attention to the work of Bogusz Wasik, who actually has published quite a lot in English and I think represents the state of the art on castle studies in Prussia. And for Livonia, Eva Osa of the Institute of History of Latvia, she completed her PhD on castles in the 1990s in Koronia and then becomes the leading scholar of the new generation of archaeologists working on castles in Latvia. She published the medieval Latvian castle series you can see there, and then others have taken up the mantle. I've already mentioned Zigruda Rapala for Cessis, but you can see there the volumes published for Cessis and Torida Castle, that's actually a bishop's castle, have begun in recent years to produce monographs and edited volumes, basically dealing with all the post-excavation work from these castles. The same with Estonia, largely published by museums. I put the example there of Viljandi Castle excavations, and the major castle of the order in what is today Western Lithuania at Klaipeda that was excavated by Vladas Žulkus from the mid-1970s through to 2002. So a lot of work done there as well, although very little of that castle survives. So thank you for your attention. If you are interested in following up on castles or the archaeology of this region in a more accessible language, please do have a look at these books that I've been publishing now for a few years, and also the website of our project that we ran across the Eastern Baltic region from 2010 to 2014. And I just want to flag the book on the far right, The Black Cross, is going to be published at the end of January. So, in a few weeks' time, a couple of months' time, which will also give you a good overview of the castles in the medieval Baltic region. So, thanks very much. I will stop there.